and thanks everyone for joining today. We're going to quickly go through a little high-level, introduction to what Acceldata does, where we work, and kind of our approach and our take on the modern data ecosystem. And then we'll go a little deeper into Snowflake specifically. So we'll talk about some of the challenges people face with Snowflake, some of the successes, and then we'll basically take you through a quick tour of what we mean by data observability for Snowflake and how this can really help you align, your spending with the value you're getting out of your data platform. I think we'll stop at the end and basically, we have a survey as well. We'd also love at the end to basically bring anyone aboard, do a deeper custom tailored demo to you, and even get you onto the platform and give it for, take it for a spin and give us your feedback, and then go from there. So it should be an exciting webinar here, I hope, and excited to take questions at the end as well. Here's our teaser to the survey. So we've got this up. I think we'll put the link out in the Zoom chat if we haven't already. Please go ahead and take this. This is going to ask you all about your Snowflake usage and then sort of figure out, where this might plug into you. Appreciate all the feedback here as well. All right, so let's start with Acceldata, who we are, what we focus on, what we do. So we're about 4 years old. We just crossed our 4-year mark here. We're up to about 160 employees worldwide here. So a lot of people out of Hortonworks, Cloudera, Google. I was at DataRobot along with some of our colleagues here for about 4.5 years, as well as some of the key, data, observability, not data observability, but observability companies around the world. So strong enterprise background here, strong data background, and really our focus is to simplify and scale data operations at enterprise companies, across the world. So looking at compute, pipelines, data all together. And I'll explain a little bit what that means as we go further. But I think that's what that combination of intertwining these together, I think, is one of our key focus areas. We're fortunate to work closely with companies like Oracle, HealthEdge, Pratt & Whitney. You see some over here on the left here, and many more as well. Really solving these problems where data is in the lifeblood of the business and critical to driving revenue and operational success. So we're proud to have partner with those customers, work with those customers, and look at their issues here. Okay, so what does this mean? Data observability, multidimensional, and why do we keep coming back to saying, hey, data pipelines, the compute layer like Snowflake itself, and then the data itself are critical? Well, this is a little bit of the reason why. So as you're looking to bring these across and work in a cloud environment, one, these environments are updating all the time. So things are coming in every 2 weeks. Like, I don't know how many people read the release notes on all of these platforms, but great things are coming out from these, and they're being delivered to you much faster than in the past when you might upgrade your software at your own cadence, maybe twice a year or once a year even. So things are coming out quickly. They're changing quite a bit in good ways, also in ways that can cause complications for existing workflows. But the issue with this, especially, so that's one side, is keeping up to date. I think the other aspect really comes into what the data is used for itself, right? So when data is these days being used, it's often, yes, there are the BI and reporting use cases that we've always had, but increasingly there's use in data marketplaces and then for machine learning applications, essentially. And that requires a different level of response and scrutiny, a different type of analysis in some ways than some of the things in the past did. And so having this association of what are we spending on this, how are we operating this effectively, with what are we ending up using this for, and is it suitable for that purpose? And do we know, can we assure that, before it goes out the door? These are a couple of elements that tie together. I would say the last bit that we'll come into as we get into this is that the great thing, and maybe the double-edged sword of some of the cloud data platforms, is also around basically some of the billing model and expense there. So one of the aspects you'll see with this is you pay as you go. You pay for what you use, and that's great. But what that means is when what you're using, and in the case of data, this is sort of known to be pretty common and tragically common. When if you're using bad data, you're paying for the queries on that as you go, just as you are for the good data. And in some ways, actually even more, if you consider the ways that bad data or duplicate rows or things like this can end up actually being higher cost than good queries. So these are some of the aspects where tying all of this together and providing a single place that intersects basically the three main constructs, the pipeline, the platform, and the data itself, becomes quite essential to be best in class and staying on the cutting edge of using this technology for great use cases while still staying, within the parameters of a general budget. So, many of these things, we've seen, great to get started with Snowflake and Databricks and these tools like this. Like, it's an incredible experience for anyone who's worked in data, contrasting it to the past. You do end up with some unpredictability. And then this question of, what are we doing right? Are we up to date on the absolute latest, best way to do this or not? And I think it's quite difficult. It's a full-time job to stay on top of this, even for one platform, let alone for complex enterprise environments where you have several. So this is one of the things that basically, Acceldata is oriented towards doing, and we'll talk specifically about Snowflake to this. We'll talk about spend intelligence. So understanding the shape of what you have today, how does that break down across all sorts of dimensions? And then how much of that should really be, reduced or changed? And I think one of the key elements we'll talk about here is, one of the things we want to do is help you kind of, potentially trim the fat or make the easy choices, right? There's a phase that you might get to as you go far along where, hey, we need to understand whether we staff, or whether we fund this project or that project or that project. And now we need to understand the value of each of those and their trajectory. And that's an important aspect. And that is something we can help facilitate. But I think what we also want to do is find the areas that are before that, right? What are the areas where you don't need to make that hard choice? You just need to apply this configuration or apply this control or catch this data before it comes in and contaminates your warehouse and you run the query again and again. Those are some of the things that we try to catch. So you kind of get the best of both worlds here. And the last bit here is finally important. This last layer is on the bottom for a reason, right? This is the foundation of any success you're going to have in data-based projects, whether that's internal for reporting or especially external for basically monetization purposes or machine learning. And is the data you're working on actually good? And how deeply do you know that, and do you trust that, and can you verify that? And so we'll talk about kind of the foundation that Acceldata provides underneath there as well. So with that, that's a little intro. So we won't just talk about it, we'll actually show it. So let me jump over here to our cloud environment here. And again, I think one of the great things we'd love to do with people at the end of this, we'd love to talk about setting up an account for you, connecting your Snowflake, and really just showing you some of the insights we're going to show here, some of the sort of checkup, health check, things like this. That's something that comes very quickly as you connect your account. So we'll just take this for one of our examples here. And sort of just to set the stage here, what we're going to be doing is a little bit of a tour through all of the entities that we've got here, right? So we've seen it on the slide. Now we'll see it in the product and understand how these things connect to each other. So just as a preview, we're starting off with the idea, hey, I'm responsible basically for effectiveness with Snowflake. I'm accountable to someone who holds the budget around Snowflake, and I want to make sure I am bending the cost curve in a way that makes sense. And I also want to make sure that I can actually communicate, yes, we've done the right things here. We have optimized this as much as it can be optimized. And here's the benefit we're getting from it. And, here's why we need to have our budget, be what it is in order to support the sustained growth over the next cases here. What we'll see actually underneath this is you can sort of see side by side here, right? So one is sort of the nuts and bolts, who's using this, what's the platform, and we'll dig into this, where all the queries are tracking, all the data sets that are using this. But actually underneath all of this, and this is one of the unique elements, we're actually also looking at the data sets themselves. So all of these data assets that we have across here, these have data reliability policies configured on them, being executed on them all the time, and basically giving us alerts and updates on, is this covered, is this not covered, is it succeeding, is it failing? Right. So let's just drill into one of these and start to understand a little bit around the shape of what we're able to do here. So we'll start basically with the descriptive side. And again, this is something that comes very quickly just by connecting in. So what this will do is just give you a view, essentially, what are we spending on this? What are the facts around what we've been spending month over month? How is that trending? And how does that break down across the different types of ways that you can sort of be billed for Snowflake? So In most cases, most commonly, like the biggest line item will be around warehouse compute, although you'll actually find if you dig in a little more, sometimes some of these serverless features and even indirectly storage, which is then used by some of these serverless features, like ends up being quite significant as well. So that can be a little bit of a hidden one that creeps up as well. But in any case, what we're essentially showing is, I think the successful adoption of Snowflake up and to the right a little bit here, we're into the present month, but I have no doubt, our analysts and our team will be able to rack this up even higher this month. We also do the very simple breakdowns, that you'd expect across some of the key entities here. So specifically warehouses and compute is where this comes in. We'll talk about queries in a second, but essentially capturing across the board, okay, within a month, when do we start using this? Does this start spiking at the end? Because that's when we run our monthly reports, and that's consuming a lot of it. So a lot of these patterns start to at least give you a sense, even visually, of how predictable is this? How stable are we going? Like, what do we even have on this? And so you'll see some interesting things if you connect your thing here. Similarly, I think one of the nice aspects of this is then understanding the great thing about these data sources is like they can scale up and down. They're not used when they don't bill you when idle. But it might be interesting then to understand when are these actually in use and attribute who is using them at what time. So one of the aspects here is if there's a specific warehouse, and in this case, we've got 100 warehouses in here. So this is a big complex setup. But what we can do is basically apply any filter on this and say, oh, this group, this default warehouse or the cloud services only warehouse, like they're using this at a bit of an unusual time of day. So what's going on with this? Do they need to rerun it? What's going on? Like this helps us start to at least have a launching off point to understand what's typical and then what's a deviation from typical. And we do this for everything else. We won't go through the whole tour, but all the other aspects around storage, things like that. We'll come to queries in a second. I think the place where this really starts to bite people in some cases is around the contract context. So this allows you to sort of put in what is your contract, what have you pre-purchased here, and basically how are you running against that. And so what'll happen in many cases, and I think it can be a mark of success in adoption of Snowflake across the organization, but what can happen is people, kind of consuming faster than what they budgeted for. And that could be people tried it and they loved it and they wanted to use more. It could be they shared their login or they gave a login to someone else. They started using it. Could be the data was larger than expected. Like there's any number of causes of this, and we help you diagnose many of those. But the fact is, understanding where you are against your budget, I think starts to make this a really interesting conversation around, do we need what we're getting out of this, and what do we need to adjust in order to do better in the future? So in this case, we'll basically take the history of what's being used here. We'll kind of roll that forward a bit and give you a little bit of a preview of, if you continue down this path, where would you be as you get closer to the end of the contract here? So what this prompts ends up being basically, this prompts the question then of, okay, if we're getting this, what are we getting out of it? And so one of the ways that we help answer that is to basically bring in an organizational view on top of this. So in this case, it might be 2 units, but really even for very complex organizations, you can put in complex nested organizational units within this and essentially do a chargeback or a show back, kind of illustrating, which organization was using how much at what time. And, what does the pattern of growth of that look like? So we've actually seen some interesting examples of this where groups like ramp up surprisingly quickly. And this also becomes a relevant insight, not only for understanding, hey, it's people using it, are we being kind of charging back in the way we want to, but also what's the adoption going to look like going forward? If we know that the last 6 groups that adopted it kind of went through this path and this curve, well, we just had 2 more pick it up. What's their curve going to be like? How do I forecast that for next year? And so getting that kind of budgeting aspect together and understanding what's being used, I think can be quite useful in getting controls under this as well. The last bit I'll catch up on just before we dig into the question, hey, how do we get this under control? How do we start to adjust and shape what we've got here? Will be around alerts. So what we've shown so far has been a lot of the retrospective, hey, this is what's happened. Here's where we are. The other aspect though is like, you'll want to catch this, before it happens. So for illustration, we've still got some that we'll show in a second that are maybe not conforming to the best practices we flag. But one of the things that's important to note is out of the box, like this comes with about 30 alerts across all sorts of dimensions, whether that's performance related around queries being queued or sensitive user updates, basically any number of elements around roles, users, warehouses, the key entities come out of the box here. And I think this is quite important for sort of the responsible adoption, I think, where let's say the cost-effective expansion of Snowflake within an organization, or same for any other cloud data platform. We've got a different set of alerts for Databricks and so on. But this is quite important to have this out of the box, because I think one of the key things that happens is that, if you kind of miss a step on some of these things, you end up, ultimately paying the price, literally. If there's one thing that doesn't have a resource monitor and one insert command runs on it, we've seen instances where that's just an incredible amount of money that goes down on one mistake there. So I think one of our key tenets on this is, yes, we're giving you descriptions. Yes, we'll talk about some of the diagnostics and things there, but actually having these alerts set up and going out to email or Slack or Teams or whatever it might be, it is, I think, a key way of going from the basically descriptive piece into the proactive piece. Okay, so with that, many of these things are flagged in there, but let's just show a little bit. What are some of the things that we look at when we're saying, how can we improve our cost effectiveness with Snowflake? So one is to start with users. So coming in and identifying users who have, perhaps permissions they shouldn't. Like, I don't know that we need 17 people with account admin permissions on this. And so identifying who has this, what role they have, should these people really actually have it? And then what's their default warehouse, I think, is another key element. So larger warehouse is going to eat up, and you may not need everyone at this. This is one way to start saying, okay, I don't think I need, I think I need this. If I tighten this down, I can get the same output more or less aligned to our business priorities, but without some of the maybe less controlled spending that we had. I think the other lens where this comes up quite a bit is on the resource monitor side and timeout. So the great thing about these platforms, you can spin them up, you get going very quickly. There may be a little forgiving, in terms of how far you can go before things are sort of cut off. And so I think there's one school of thought that's, kind of, we need to really lock this down, and like, you need to ask permission before you start a warehouse, and there's ways to make it very rigorous and kind of, in some sense, turn it into like a traditional database. That's not our recommendation, really, and I don't think that's what our users like to see. But what we do like to see is having some level of control and flagging of, hey, this has no resource monitor, or this still has the statement default timeout of 2 days, which depending on the warehouse, size could end up being quite significant. So these are things that get flagged, that get alerted on just by connecting your data, or just by connecting your Snowflake account. You'll get kind of a list of these as just sort of points to go ahead and sort of address and clean up. So that's for things that are being used potentially in excess, or going a little wild there at a couple of levels. I think there's a couple, there's the other inverse of this, right? Which is basically things that aren't being used or that are potentially a little out of date. So some of these are kind of just more logistical cleanup. If we have users who aren't being logged in, we have warehouses that are just sitting there and aren't being used, we just get rid of those who don't pay attention. I think the ones that are more interesting down this track end up being around tables that are not being used. So storage may not be the top line item directly, although you'd be surprised like what it can contribute to, but it might not be the top line directly. But if we've got it there, that's a free win to kind of archive that or remove some of these tables, assuming it's not being used and we can prove that that's the case. I think one of the other quite interesting ones is around driver usage. So this is something that these platforms are updating all the time, and the driver updates the small thing, but it adds up. I mean, if you think about maintaining the latest version of the driver, updated every couple of weeks, from every cloud data platform vendor, that's sort of like a free lunch out there that's not being picked up. And so we flag this for you, we highlight that, and just sort of say, hey, like, if someone is writing all these queries, like our automation is using an out of date JDBC driver, That's something where if we just update this to the most recent one, we're going to get certainly some security fixes, but often performance fixes as well. Okay, and now we get into maybe the more of the big spenders here. So now we get into basically queries and warehouses. So let's start with warehouses. We'll just go through this. So warehouses are running, and we basically break down along a number of dimensions here. And let's see if we filter down to one of them. Let's see if we zoom in on this. So one of the things we'll highlight across here will basically be, is something is the warehouse the right size? And so one of the ways that you can measure this is essentially, how much are queries being queued or not. And so what we find in one of these cases is basically if we, for one of these warehouses, like there's almost no load most of the time, or sorry, almost none of the time is it really saturated. And so this is a great candidate to potentially downsize this, take it from a small to an extra small, an extra large to a medium. And that can have significant cost savings with, again, no real loss in functionality. That's one of the ways in which you can take this and kind of redirect it. Similarly, you may have cases where, warehouses are undersized. We start with a default, and then we can just scale it up. Now, what's interesting about this, and we won't talk about too much about things that are coming, but one of the interesting things that many of you may have seen from the Snowflake Summit was around the query acceleration service. And so that's another trait that gets into this, where people are often concerned, hey, instead of resizing the warehouse, which is more of a static change, let me change this at the per query level and accelerate that. And that's very much something that we'll be facilitating with Acceldata as that sort of matures here, because we have the information about the warehouse. We have historical patterns. We don't want you to need to worry about micromanaging, scaling those up and down, even though that is a huge driver of what the cost is. We want to help you allocate that effectively. Now, one of the interesting aspects then is looking at the query level. So here we're now we're breaking down across the queries, essentially, where they're spending time, and then flagging the ones that are the longest running, that are spelling to disk, things like this, basically the queries that are potentially most in need of some sort of optimization or things like this. Now, the reason this becomes interesting is not only the usual aspects of understanding, we're spending this much on this, what are we getting? But then getting into the actual cost of this. So, we mentioned before that you can filter you can grab some of these. Let's just go down to a couple of these. And apply that. Not only that you can come in and basically measure their performance, but you can actually attribute a cost to it based on the size of the warehouse and the duration of the query. That's good. That puts a cost on it. I think what's actually quite interesting then is to look at, is this data any good? What's the value of this data? And this is where having a data reliability foundation becomes quite decisive in kind of a cloud data environment. So what we're able to say, these are trivial queries, but I think many people who have worked with Snowflake here could talk about queries that run in the thousands, even tens of thousands, for some of the more complex operations here, or certainly ones that run away a little bit. So what we're showing over here in it is kind of the element underneath the query. So the data underneath it. So in this case, we're going to use an example around actually ride sharing in the city of Chicago. And so we've got a lot of information around stations, around bikes, around weather data, things like that. And really underneath all of the ones that have been crawled here, we're looking at data reliability along a number of dimensions. So policies have been set up, some automatically, some manually, for looking at things like sort of enumerated data quality rules down to changes in amount of data that's present. Is there enough data? Is there missing data? Is there duplicative data? Down to statistical data drift, and then also into schema drift. So columns disappearing, things like this. And so I think what's quite powerful around this is you may have woken up in the morning as a data platform owner on Snowflake thinking about, hey, what are we doing? What are we doing to get this under control? Where are we spending money? How do we stay on the budget? What this is starting to do is introduce another layer that can really cut out significant costs which is the data underneath it. So imagine excising, the queries that are basically being run and rerun on data that is not reliable. If that's the case, and we're not getting any value out of it, and we're incurring large costs because we're running again and again, this is a way that can be much more powerful than simply optimizing the warehouse size or things like that. Those aren't simple tasks, but this is a different track to augment those. And so what I wanted to do here was zoom in a little bit into basically what does this look like, to analyze data reliability? What are the different types of things that we have across the board? And then, I think one of the big elements would be, how does this fit into the larger data pipeline that we've got running across potentially multiple sources, and what that means? So I'll do a quick run through of this, just as a couple of the elements like in here, this will capture. So the way this works is every time, data is coming through, we're essentially analyzing that new data and applying a whole set of policies and rules against it. So here we're showing just sort of interesting data differences between different executions of this, but we also have actual official policies set up on this. So I'll take you through a couple examples of this, but essentially looking at simple things from, hey, do we have are there too many nulls on this? Like, is this column that's unique, the ID, actually still unique in this execution? These are relatively simple. We capture exactly which ones fail. If you want to go back and say, hey, this is what's wrong, you provided me this data, go fix it, right? So this all gets flagged and summarized across all these dimensions. I think a couple of the other ones we highlight, just to give a sense, right? So if we go down the list here, basically those are the deterministic enumerations. We also capture things that are a little more sophisticated. These don't come automatically. You got to toggle it on. But basically, you can toggle on all sorts of statistical checks on how this data compares to past runs, right? So looking at how different derived metrics have changed over time, going page by page across these. This is the type of thing that I don't think it's not the right thing to do on every data set all the time and every attribute. The place where it's good to do it is on the really important attributes, the ones that are used in dashboards, or even more importantly, the ones that are feeding into machine learning models that rely heavily on those features. So those are the ones where understanding that something has changed, even if it's non-deterministic, become quite helpful in understanding, is this data even worth processing further along? Similarly, we go through and we can look at basically data cadences and how quickly data is coming in. Where are there gaps when we expected the data to be delivered and it's not there? How has this changed over all the previous times? It's kind of like the standard checks that you want to happen on data. And this just happens automatically as a factor of bringing your data into the system. Okay, so that's sort of the standard checks all across the board. And what this means is if we think back to me querying, kind of on this compute side, right? And I'm coming in and trying to understand, what are we spending? Where is that money going? Well, I can go really back and forth and say, hey, well, if this hasn't been set up, let me go set it up. It's very easy to come set this up. Now I have data quality coverage. And if I'm spending, a certain amount of money on queries against a data set, I really should have some amount of data quality coverage on it. And even as a data platform owner, that's something I might insist on and set our policy around. So this is one of the ways where these things, really start to connect. But actually, it's much bigger than this. So if you think about this, this is one data set along the way. This is station status telling you a little bit about what's happening there. That's great. That's great. But what's really matters is basically the entire pipeline. So this is actually quite far downstream in the pipeline. This originated this is actually real data. We run it like 4 or 5 times a day usually. But this is really getting data off of a site, going through, getting loaded into Snowflake. And so when that data is introduced bad, what we want to do is shift our analysis of the quality as far left as possible. We want to catch this at the file level, outside the warehouse, before it goes through all of this. Why do we want to do that? Well, 1, because this is what's actually used by downstream systems, but 2, because we're paying the cost every single time for each one of these queries and every time that we run this execution. So if we're going to get all the way through this and run this, and as we saw, we can quantify the costs, for every step along the way here, we want to catch it up here and prevent all of that stuff from being processed. And so that's what Acceldata does. Acceldata is providing this map of this pipeline This is running outside of us. This actually is an Airflow pipeline we've instrumented. We also can do this really for anything that can get to Python. So ML flow for your ML training pipelines, prefect, Dagster, things like that. Those all can be instrumented this way. But we're mapping that back into here and really applying these checks at every phase of this, right? So this is why it's important that they're able to run at scale, run efficiently, and be easy to set up, so that you can really automatically get them on every stage here. The other aspect we're looking at here, just by the way, is like, we mostly focus on cost and performance today, but we mostly focus on cost and the impact of reliability on cost. But there's also a performance angle on this. So if I'm responsible for delivering this all day, every day at a particular time and getting specifically to this phase by a particular time, being able to break down basically each of the spans, each of the events along the stage and understand how that's slowed down, versus some previous runs becomes quite important. And so that's an element that we trigger here as well, is recording the history of all of these and allowing you to kind of compare them together. So if you think about this again, where we started was, hey, we want to be using Snowflake. We've got it for important initiatives. Those initiatives are growing. We want to get things under control. What I think we've seen is that there's a number of things you can get really through best practices and sort of checks there, but really optimizing it, the higher order impact comes from really understanding the connection between the compute, like the queries, the compute, the data, and ultimately the entire pipeline with many steps. And I think many of you know, like, this is a very simple pipeline, a very limited one. If you multiply this out to what some of these looks like, or you think about how often pipelines feed from one to the next, to the next, to the next, having this map and really, stopping things at hitting eject at the earliest stage becomes quite powerful and material effect basically on the bottom line here. So that's a quick run through of the platform. The last bit I wanted to do to kind of zoom back was for those of you thinking more from a reliability perspective. Hey, I have so much data going on. Where do I start with this stuff? So I'd say one of the aspects is like we want to be pragmatic on this stuff. Like, it's about efficiency, effectiveness. And so one of the things that we do is basically we make it easy to instrument to sort of add coverage to all of these. And then we kind of bubble up this summary. So this type of summary is telling you, how much of your data that's actually used heavily, it has the adequate level of coverage and basically success. So on this aspect, we're looking at our data reliability aspect. Some of these are good, some of these are bad. But what we really care about are these, right? The usage aspect, what's being used often, and is that data actually good? And if it's not, now let's take the next step and let's add some coverage on it. So what you want to avoid, which we have in this scenario, is basically things up in this left quadrant, where something's both heavily used and like ultimately unreliable. So I think that's a great way to flip the perspective a little bit from, hey, data shall have all of this coverage and we shall have this great ideal state, and maybe not being able to reach that, to more of the data engineer perspective, maybe of, our job is to make this work effectively. That means some amount of cost awareness, some amount of prioritization. So that's a little bit of what we highlight here, as well as information on what's the level of coverage that you have, how long has it been since you've gone through and updated this data. Ideally for many of these cases, you're going to want it as as close to real time as possible, specifically if you're adding data out, you're sending up data outside the organization. But I think this becomes a key dimension as people's assets increase as well. So with that, I think that's kind of a brief tour of the platform, right? Like we've shown, I think, hopefully how a lot of these components that people traditionally in the on-premise world have thought of as distinct actually fit together quite well. And hopefully given a sense of how, by connecting your sources here, you start to get a much more operational awareness and like deep insight into keeping things on the right track here. So with that, I'll check out the Q&A here and happy to take any other questions as well.